Well, here we have a very majestic and large and in charge 1973 Chrysler New Yorker. This is the last year for the fuselage body styling for Chrysler. It was introduced in 1969, and it was called fuselage just because of the shape of the overall body, having these very smooth side sections that are unbroken and this distinct tumble home into the roof, where the roof is narrower than the midsection of the body. Just an overall handsome and clean, elegant appearing vehicle. Although for 1973, this was the first year where these vehicles were restyled in the front, presumably in part due to the 5-mile-an-hour impact standard that was introduced that year. You can see these huge bumper guards were also added. Chrysler had those both front and rear on numerous vehicles so that they could take the impact associated with that new Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard. And I think this 1973 model, the front end is a bit overwrought and overdone, especially when you compare it to the 1972 New Yorker and before, which has just an elegant shape to it. The fuselage cars for Chrysler were introduced in 1969, and as I said, 1973 was the last year. And I don't think that there's a bad-looking one that's out there. This is a C-body, full-size Chrysler, and really doesn't get much more full size than this unless you bought a 73 Imperial, which was the longest production car ever made, at least non-limousine production car. That Imperial rode atop 127-inch wheelbase and was 235 inches in overall length, just 5 inches short of 20 feet. This 1973 New Yorker is, I guess, diminutive by comparison, at only 230 inches in overall length, 5 less than the Imperial. It's riding atop 124-inch wheelbase. Both cars, as well as all of these fuselage C-bodies, were unibody vehicles for Chrysler, and it's pretty amazing that you can have such a large car that's unibody without its own frame, although that was true of the 1958 to 60 Lincolns that were also very large and rode atop 131-inch wheelbase. Looking out back here, you can also see those large bumper guards protruding from the rear bumper. And note that the bumper goes up into the sides of the vehicle. Chrysler advertised this as a way to get more protection on the rear of the vehicle. And I guess that's partly true. If you back into something and you ding the bumper, I guess you can just replace the bumper as opposed to having body work done. Although that could not be a cheap bumper, at least that would be my guess. Notice here as well that this car has this beautiful, just gently rising belt line underneath the glass. And these cars are quite tall in length. Look at the height of the rear quarter panel here. These, I would say, overall are about 2 inches higher in cowl height than the Cadillacs of the era. And when you see one in a parking lot, compared to a GM or Ford of the era, these appear much taller in overall height and appearance than the Lincolns and Cadillacs. Gives them a bit more of an imposing stature. Also notice the fender skirt. There is a fender skirt on this car, but it is so tiny. I don't quite know why Chrysler did that. And the Imperial had a tiny fender skirt as well. Turning now to the inside, you can see the 73 New Yorker has some rather tasteful cloth bench seats. There is a center armrest up front. This one, interestingly, does not have power windows. You can see the crank handle at the bottom. It does have the vent windows as well, but everything was pretty much optional on these vehicles, despite it being really a near top-of-the-line car. The New Yorker Brougham was one step up from this in the Chrysler lineup. Imperial was still its own car, so not technically a Chrysler during this time. But these Chryslers did have a dash that has very legible instruments. You can see the large size font for the speedometer. There are warning lights above the speedometer, including a cold light for those who like it. And the HVAC controls are off to the right-hand side. There are only 4 outlet vents in the IP, 2 in the lower area that you can see here, those round sort of vents, and then 2 that are placed in the middle of the IP. There are some vents beneath the dash that you can open or close to your pleasure if you want a bit more airflow. But actually, these cars, this works just fine, amazingly. And check out the door panel for 1973 on these New Yorkers. It was jazzed up a bit versus the earlier model years, because I think that some customers complained that the New Yorker was a pretty expensive car, on par in terms of pricing with the Olds 98 and the Buick Electra. And the door panels just looked rather cheap, as you can see here on the 1972 version. So Chrysler added some faux wood grain to give them a bit more interest. Interestingly, the glove box door on these is a textured metal, and interesting process that Chrysler used to do that. Here's another picture of the front seat. You can see that center armrest. And notice the belt buckle location on these Chryslers and how the belt buckle is right next to that piece of metal trim that outlines the seat. That is one strange thing about these vehicles, and that is, obviously back in 1973, not too many people wore seat belts. But if you leave that unbuckled, it tends to have an ability to clang against that metal trim piece, which is kind of annoying. If you do buckle it, then obviously that's not a problem. But I will say these Chrysler belts also do cinch rather tightly compared to the other domestics of the era, particularly from GM and Ford. And the overall driver's seating position is, and people are going to laugh at me for this, but a bit more racing inspired. The steering wheel, you can see the column protrudes out further than it does on the GM and Chryslers of the era. The seatbelt cinches rather tight. These cars do have some road feel in the steering. This is not a steering wheel that you can turn easily with one finger or a pinky finger as compared to the Ford steering gears of the era. Chrysler by this point, and even a little bit earlier than this, was really trying to emphasize, I would say, handling over the ride quality. And these vehicles are not the best, consequently, in terms of ride. They do have a rather harsh ride for the era. They have torsion bars up front and leaf springs in the rear, but they do handle extremely well for their size. And the steering is pretty pleasant. It has some effort that's required to turn the wheel, unlike the Fords of the era where you really can turn it with the pinky. And the seatbelt does cinch you pretty tightly in place, so you feel like you're piloting a very, very large race car in some cases, especially with the 440 underhood, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. And here's the rear passenger compartment. No armrest in the rear. It's interesting, some of the domestics on the lower trim lines would give you the armrest in the rear and not the front. This one gives you the armrest in the front and not the rear, which I think tends to make more sense. But notice the legroom in these. Chrysler, I would say, in general, had some of the best packaging of the era in terms of overall interior roominess. The doors swing open very wide so that you can get into the rear easily. And you have a ton of legroom, even with the seat all the way back in these, which honestly isn't always true, despite the car size of vehicles that were competitors from GM and Ford. The rear seats weren't always all that roomy, but on the Chryslers, they tended to be. And you had quite a high roof line in these, so you also had room for a hat if you needed it. Here's one more close-up of this jazzed-up door panel for 1973, and you can see the New Yorker logo up front and the wonderful faux wood grain. Interestingly, even the pieces that affix the door pull strap to the door are faux wood grain, so it kind of blends into the overall door panel. If a buyer stepped up to the New Yorker Brougham, there was a different door panel that was a bit richer in overall look, and on the Imperials, you got a pocket to store things. Here's one more shot of the instrument panel, and you'll note those center vents that I was mentioning in the middle. The button to the left of the center vents is for the rear defog. In some of these vehicles, like the Imperial, you could get front and rear heaters as well as air conditioners, which really wasn't offered by anybody else at this point. And it's pretty amazing. I can tell you, having ridden in a car with functional front and rear air conditioning, that it takes maybe 10 seconds on a hot day to get cold air coming out of all the vents, and then you're freezing in maybe 30 seconds. This car does not have Chrysler's Auto Temp climate control, which was an automatic temperature system that was really slick and controlled by a single box under hood. Chrysler even sold the system to Mercedes, so Mercedes thought highly of it, and frankly, it works quite well. That little dial on the upper portion of the instrument panel is the front to rear speaker fader, so you can adjust where the sound is coming out of with the stereo. These cars did have some gauges. There is, as you can see, an alternator gauge. There's not a temperature gauge. So most Chryslers before this did have kind of a full gauge package, but the New Yorkers didn't. The Imperials did have the full gauge package. So not sure why Chrysler decided not to put it on the New Yorker, but they did not. And here we have an under-hood shot with the mighty 440. That sticker on the air cleaner is not correct for this particular vehicle, but somebody has added it. Oh well, it looks good. And you can also see why these cars were banned from so many demolition derbies. Look at the distance between the front grille area and the radiator support. There's over a foot there. And it's just amazing. These cars did so well in many demolition derbies as a result that they were banned. And the underlying structure is very, very robust. The 440 by this point, unfortunately, was making just 215 horsepower, and it had some of its own internals downgraded from the 1972 model year. Some of them were forged for 1972 and before, and for 1973 they were not, but still was a great engine. And despite the 215 horsepower rating, these cars feel quite peppy when you're driving them normally. They don't necessarily have the greatest passing power, but driving around town, they feel, again, very peppy, have plenty of acceleration, and you can cruise all day long on the freeway in these 80 plus miles an hour. Very, very strong vehicles. I will say one element that is unfortunate under hood here in these fuselage era Chryslers is that the spark plugs are underneath the exhaust manifolds, and they are a challenge to get to. You would think on a full-size car like this that it'd be relatively easy to do a tune-up. The distributor cap certainly is, and rotor, which is on the passenger side up front there. But the spark plugs on these cars are just a pain in the butt to get to. I've changed them on my 72 New Yorker, and I find that I get most of them out from the bottom, and that's easier. It's kind of a blind job from the top and a knuckle skinner because you're in the way of the exhaust manifold and some other items, and I certainly don't do it until the engine is fully cooled down, which, by the way, you should always do for aluminum head engines, because you can pull the threads out if you try to take the spark plugs out while the engine's still hot. Regardless, this 440 was standard in the New Yorker in 1973 and pushed the car around just fine. It's a great engine, very quiet, very silent, and smooth running. You can also see the Chrysler 2-piston air conditioning compressor here, which did a very effective job at cooling the cabin. Hope you enjoyed this video on this 1973 Chrysler New Yorker. If you did, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and check out the video thumbnails at bottom left and right for some suggestions for you.